Hi, the following content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. If you are a healthcare provider, please consult with your affiliated institution or local ethics committee for ethical guidance related to clinical practice. Thank you.
Hello, ethics enthusiasts. It's Russ and David again, and with a brand new module. I'm not going to tell you when we're recording, but it's way after the pandemic. And today's topic is forbidden knowledge. Take it away, David.
I'm not sure it's way after the pandemic because it depends how you define when it's over. It may never be over.
For historical context, the pandemic happened in 2020, and then life continued, and we continued to get COVID for several years after that, at least. And we're in that period after the couple of several years.
Okay, right. That sounds good. Okay, so today we're going to talk about forbidden knowledge, obviously a highly relevant topic for thinking about the ethics of both gain-of-function research and synthetic biology, and the idea that there's all these different issues of sensitive knowledge and sensitive research. The idea of forbidden knowledge has a long history. There were efforts by the Catholic Church to restrict knowledge, for example, astronomical studies. Way back when. So people are familiar with Galileo being arrested and under house arrest for his observations and claims about a heliocentric rather than a geocentric universe. So that's an example of forbidden knowledge. Prohibitions on Western literature in some countries would be another example of forbidden knowledge. Book banning, which sadly has become, my wife's a librarian, and this has become very prominent around the country. And then maybe more familiarly in the scientific context, top secret classification of atomic or nuclear information. Those are all with long history of this kind of work and of this type of forbidden knowledge. So let's go through the types of forbidden knowledge that exist and think about it and its relevance to the bioengineering topics we're talking about. The first type of forbidden knowledge are examples of knowledge that are forbidden because of how the research was conducted. That is, it's seen as tainted or forbidden because it was obtained in an unethical manner. So, for example, there's actually a big debate, and in fact, there's a book that Art Kaplan and others wrote about this issue, about whether or not the things that were learned during the Nazi atrocities through their unethical experiments, whether the knowledge that they produced should be touched in any way or utilized if it turned out some of that information was useful. I did a review for Lancet about this during a big public infection bird flu outbreak, 23 years ago or something. There was some data from unethical research that had been done on American soldiers who were prisoners of war in Japan, and there was a question about whether or not that these research results might have shed some interesting light on some of some avenues for research for the bird flu, and whether or not it would be ethical to use some of that. So this is a sense of forbidden knowledge, as in this is forbidden fruit. Some knowledge might have been produced, but it was done in such a horrible way. Should we even be able to use that? And one of the big worries about that is that if you allow that research to be utilized, you may wind up encouraging people to engage in unethical behaviors, right? So if it turns out that if you do research in bad ways, the research still winds up being utilized, it may prevent people from adequately punishing folks for doing some bad things. Another interesting example and debate that we had about this, the stems in South Korea, Husa Hwang, before they knew that this was fraudulent, had done some what seemed to be groundbreaking research on human embryonic stem cell research, in which he showed that they could actually derive human embryos from cloning, so they actually were able to clone these embryos, which was seen as a massive breakthrough scientifically. But there were some ethical problems with the way they conducted their research. For example, when one of the women who worked in his lab had accidentally destroyed a batch of these embryos, he basically insisted that she replace them, and so she wound up having to donate her own eggs for research
Whoa,
purposes.
whoa.
Whoa, indeed.
Made a research tech donate eggs.
Went with her to the IVF clinic.
Wow.
And so the question is, so there were some other ethical problems with the consents and things like that. However, it was also seen at the time, before people knew it was fraud, as a major scientific breakthrough, massive scientific breakthrough. So the question really becomes, should science have the question, should they publish the results? Here's this important major breakthrough. Here are these important ethical concerns about the research they're conducted. Should they publish them? And they actually asked Mildred Cho and I to review this and help them make that decision. We said yes, but that they should publish an ethics article that accompanied it, which she and I wound up writing, saying here are things that they got wrong and it would have to be done right for any research like this to be done in the future. But one could worry that
we will write an editorial.
Yeah. Saying why they were
Good
bad.
call.
But it's hard because you worry that, I mean, certainly at the time they were being lionized and the ethical concerns were receding into the background. And you certainly worry that by publishing it, the punishments may not be, and even saying that there are these problems may not be enough to dissuade other people that, if it works out that you really push things forward, you're going to get away with it, even if you do things in a bad way. And so that becomes sort of a problem with this kind of knowledge that's forbidden because it was conducted in an unethical fashion. And this leads to the second form of forbidden knowledge, which are prohibitions on certain ways of doing science. Right. So, which is like the kind of things that Dr. He did. That would have been another nice example. Dr. He, it was terrible what he did, but we will learn a lot from those kids and potentially studying those kids produced by Dr. He, who we talked about earlier in the course on CRISPR. So the idea behind the prohibitions is that there are limits to how you're allowed to treat human subjects. We have regulations. There's limits to how you can treat animals. And so, we could learn a lot more and there's lots of things we could do if we didn't have to get informed consent from people and could just use them in randomized experiments, whether they wanted to or not. We could learn a lot more and a lot faster, but you can't because there are prohibitions on certain ways of doing science. So that's theoretical knowledge that at least should be prohibited. Every now and then
the difference between this and the first one is in the first one, they went ahead and did it and it was determined to be unethical. Here, you're prospectively saying we don't want people to do this.
Correct. So the second one is here's ways of doing research that shouldn't happen and that stop theoretical kinds of research from happening.
Right.
If somebody violates those rules anyway, you now have the problem of forbidden fruit that was produced from it and not wanting to encourage others to violate those kinds of rules.
So it can lead to number one.
Right. If somebody violates those prohibitions.
All right.
Okay, so those are the first two types of forbidden knowledge. The third one are prohibitions on the publishing of information to the public. So the huge debates around the sequencing of pathogens, for example, or how to synthesize pathogens, or for gain-of-function research, huge debates about we talked about the H5N1 example in one of your other videos, debates about whether to publish something that basically shows how to take a virus that right now isn't so bad for humans and make it more deadly. So we already have lots and lots of examples of cases where we have prohibitions on publishing of information. That's why we have classified research. So there is classified research and research that is just essentially dead on arrival in terms of being able to get to the general public. And then in the realm of synthetic biology and sequencing and gain-of-function research, there are debates about whether or not some of this research should be open or whether some of that should be done under classified restrictions on making that available to the public. So those are really big, outstanding problems with that third
Now
form.
here, the research may have been done ethically. It's a question of the results are too sensitive to share. So they're forbidden to some, but they're not forbidden to everybody.
Correct. They're forbidden to most of the public, but people who have clearance
Right.
and security clearance would still have access. But it makes it very different from the way science normally operates, where everything's free and open, at least in theory,
Right.
to the whole scientific community. Okay.
Yep.
And then the fourth area is prohibitions on studying things that may have negative social consequences. And this is basically research where you decide that the juice is not worth the squeeze, and we shouldn't do certain kinds of research. So, for example, in the 70s, the scientific community. Oops, I got my thing is super sensitive, so that whenever if my thumb goes
Did
up
you
while
just
I'm
give us a
talking,
thumbs up?
if I lift my thumb, that happens. If I just raise my hand like this, if I just hold it up for a certain amount of time, the hand up
Oh, I
goes
didn't
up.
know that.
Yeah, so I have to figure out the presetting. Does yours do it? You'll have a little picture of the thumb and a little thing that circles around.
No, no. I think we should get back to the content, but this
Yeah,
is
that's
a lot of fun.
yeah.
It's great to be
Good.
back. It's great to,
It
these are
is.
all improvements in Zoom.
Yeah. So anyway, so the idea here is that for Silomar in the 70s, when people were worried about the power of recombinant DNA and what it might do, we didn't have very good confinement techniques, physical and bioconfinement techniques in place at that time. There were a lot of worries about what researchers might do, and it was dangerous. And there, the scientific community came together at a famous meeting in 1975 at Asilomar. Paul Berg, David Baltimore, and some other colleagues got together and decided that they were just going to put a moratorium on all recombinant DNA research for a few years while they sorted out like what it would take for it to be safe to be able to go forward with that kind of research. So that moratorium would be an example of saying, like, right now, the social consequences of this kind of research are potentially too great, and we should not do it until we're assured that it's safe to do so. And there's a lot of debates right now about whether certain kinds of research involving race might be intrinsically so harmful or potentially likely to be misused and abused that the juice is not worth the squeeze to do that research, and that we just shouldn't do certain kinds of research on race or with racial categories. So that would be the fourth kind. I'm curious. I'm going to talk about the fifth one in a second, but before we started this video, Russ was skeptical that there was such a thing as forbidden knowledge. Have I persuaded you that there is such a thing as forbidden
Yes,
knowledge?
I misunderstood its meaning to mean things that we should never know. And only a couple of these categories, like this one, it's not even what we should know. It's that the questions that will be asked are going to be hard to pose, hard to report, and people with agendas could misuse them. So yeah, so now I understand, and I'm a little bit more convinced that there are areas where we should forbid either the knowledge, the dissemination of the knowledge, how the knowledge was produced. Yes, I accept it as a valid category for a module.
Okay, good. And then the fifth one is agnotology, and this one is probably more ethically problematic as a category. Agnotology, so epistemology is the study of the production of knowledge, and agnotology is the study of the production of ignorance.
Whoa.
And so it turns out there's a lot of concerted efforts at actually creating ignorance and turning knowledge, this is not forbidding the creation of knowledge. This is erasing of knowledge, things that we know, and making sure that it doesn't count as knowledge anymore. And so this is often done by some industries. So the tobacco industry is very famous for doing this. They have whole bunches of like statisticians they hire to cast doubt on all studies. There's a lot of people who work in the some of the same companies that specialize in creating ignorance around for tobacco industry now work in the area of global warming to try and create doubt about whether global warming really exists. So their job is to take something where scientists have reached consensus and know something and really make it seem like it's an open scientific question and the lack of certainty, and to take something that's right in the bucket of knowledge and move it out of the bucket of knowledge and turn it into something that's an issue of debate or an unknown.
Now, that's tricky, and I suspect you're about to talk about it, because normal science requires us to always evaluate our theories, and sometimes we do turn them over in the face of data. So you can see a slippery slope between new data and new analyses that in good spirits and goodwill are testing knowledge, versus the whole goal of it is to disprove it kind of, with ulterior motives.
Yes, and it has become its own. This agnotological strategy has become its own industry.
Yeah.
And even there's a company, they took us down once scholars who work on this started highlighting it, but there was a company that was bragging about how a drug that needed to be pulled off the market because the evidence showed that it was unsafe, they were able to create enough doubt about it that they were able to avoid its pulling off of the market for like 3 extra years. So the company got to sell it for 3 more years than the after it was known to be unsafe, by making it somewhat doubtful for at least a few more years. Anyway, this is a whole industry of like creating doubt. There's a book called Merchants of Doubt that talks about it, as well as many chapters in a book called Agnotology, edited by 2 Stanford professors on campus, Londa Schiebinger and Bob Proctor. And I think I think they may have a second volume coming out, or that came out. I have not seen the second volume yet.
Merchants of Doubt is a very good title.
Yeah, he wrote a Scientific American article by that same title as well. Anyway, anyway, so that's a form of forbidden knowledge where you're essentially erasing knowledge that's probably morally suspect, but just as arguably it was with what happened to Galileo, but it is something that exists. Okay, so now when we think about these kinds of forbidden knowledge, what are some of the ethical considerations or guardrails, or how should we think about where it might be appropriate to put in some of these kinds of limitations? Where is it ethically appropriate to sort of draw some of these kinds of lines? And there are a number of things to think, competing values and things to think about here, some of which are raised in some of the other ethical frameworks that we discussed in the other video on synthetic biology that you either have or are soon going to watch. So one is its impact on people, so utilitarian considerations. Yeah. Right. So what, when you're thinking about a technology and whether it ought to be forbidden, or knowledge and whether it should be forbidden, what does it do? What is the impact that it has on people? Second, issues of equity. What impact does it have on the people who are at the bottom, right? So if it makes things worse for people at the bottom, that might be a powerful reason to say that this shouldn't go forward. Even if it turns out on the whole, it's great for enough people at the top, that it may be okay on utilitarian grounds. If it creates enough of a disparity and negative impact on the people who are already worse off, it may be, from an equity point of view, not worthwhile. Third consideration, pushing the other way, are the rights to free inquiry and right to free speech. We put a very high value, especially in northern democracies of like the US, of people's right to freedom of speech and right to freedom of inquiry. And it's really been an important Enlightenment value that helped gave rise essentially to the scientific revolution whose fruits we all benefit from. And so these are very
the basis for academic freedom.
That's a basis for academic freedom. And so those are very, very important values, very important rights, that creates a fairly high bar that's set before any of these kinds of limitations on knowledge or publishing of knowledge needs to be met. If you think about these rights in like freedom of inquiry, freedom of expression. The bar for saying that like this has to be classified has to be pretty high, right? I mean, it is the case that there's lots of like nuclear weapons programs research that's classified, but the bar is high for setting that appropriately so because of these kinds of rights. And so that's really the kind of balancing act that has to go on here. Okay. Last thing I wanted to talk about is a paper by a couple of few former colleagues of mine, Joanna Kempner, John Mercer, Chuck Bosk, about controversies in the production of knowledge and really capturing scientific attitudes about these issues. And I just think it's just an interesting thing to end with some of this data. So they were asked questions about the trade-offs that we were just describing between scientific freedom and constraints. And so people were asked to agree or disagree with this statement. Science and scientists have a responsibility to seek out and report the truth, regardless of its ethical, legal, moral, and social implications. And actually, most scientists actually agreed with that statement, which I think was kind of interesting. So they actually put such a high value on that right to publish that it puts that they're loath to put any limitations. But at the same time, and this is where how you ask the question matters, when asked, society has the right to place limitations on what scientists study and how they perform their research. There was also pretty high agreement, although even there, 36% of scientists either disagreed or strongly disagreed. So they want science to be completely unfettered. So there are a lot of scientists who say, like, we should just be able to do whatever we want, however we want.
So 36% of the scientists disagreed that there should be limits.
Correct. I hope none of them do human subjects research.
Right.
So it's like, I don't need no IRB approval. Or work on animals. Who cares what the IACUC says? It's fun to torture animals. Okay, another question was, a journal editor should reject a paper if peer review concludes that data were collected using unethical methods. There was very strong agreement about that, which was interesting. And a journal editor should reject a paper if peer review concludes that the results would undermine or clash with societal norms. Overwhelming disagreement. 71% strongly disagree and 20% disagree, 91% disagree. Okay, so they're okay with doing work that violates social norms as long as the data is ethically collected. Anyway, so that's just something about how scientists view some of these kinds of trade-offs.
So this is very interesting because it's an example of kind of practical empirical ethics versus theoretical.
Yeah, which we do a lot of at my center.
I happen to know that.
Yes, and you're involved in a lot of it. So, okay. That's pretty much all I have for this module.
Thank you for tuning in. Stay tuned for the next module.